Good day and a warm, very warm welcome to all of you lovers of literature who have gathered here today at 175 Carlton Avenue to honor and celebrate one of America's pioneering writers, Richard Wright, who at this site where he lived and drafted his first novel, Native Son. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein Spielvogel, the chair of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center. Today, the HLPC, in cooperation with the Historic Districts Council, represented by Simeon Bankoff, its director, and Frampton Tolbert, its deputy director, and the Fort Greene Association, is dedicating a cultural medallion deep in the heart of Fort Greene. Cultural medallions, one of the programs of the HLPC, and you may know another, the Historic District street signs that are terracotta, black and white, that should mark all 108 historic districts and 18 extensions. Today we will focus on the Cultural Medallion program. Cultural medallions are porcelainized enamel plaques affixed to the exterior of buildings throughout New York City to commemorate an individual or an occurrence which has made a significant contribution to New York City's rich cultural heritage and to create a sense of pride in history and of place among New Yorkers and visitors alike. The medallions are placed on existing buildings associated with distinguished persons from the law, medicine, the arts, business, education, sports, politics, and inventors. Most of these people or events are nominated for inclusion by members of the public. They are then reviewed, considered, and placed in a queue. For many reasons, this particular medallion has jumped the queue. And we have thanks to Paul Palazzo and Howard Pitch for the nomination. May I give this to you? Our brief, and it is to be hoped informative program, includes remarks by respected authorities about the life and accomplishments of Richard Wright. Our first speaker is the distinguished and celebrated borough president of and ambassador from Brooklyn, the one and only Marty Markowitz. The popular borough president was first elected a New York State senator 34 years ago, and then 23 years later, in 2001, elected as Brooklyn borough president and re-elected in 2005 with almost 80% of the vote, and then re-elected once again. A tireless advocate for affordable housing, the progressive development of downtown Brooklyn, and the revival of Coney Island, as well as his effective promotion of Brooklyn. A prime mover of the renaissance of cool Brooklyn, it is my pleasure to introduce Borough President Marty Markowitz.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming.
All these good things happening, I love it. My colleague and our city council member, Letitia James, Councilman James, good to have you here. Let me thank, if I may, Paul Palazzo, Howard Pitch, always pitching for Fort Greene and Brooklyn, and the Fort Greene Association, as well as Barbara Lee Diamondstein Spielvogel, I love that name, and the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center. Your hard work and dedication have helped keep the history of Brooklyn alive and inspire generation after generation of young Brooklynites with the sights and sounds of the past. I'd also like to recognize award-winning writer, performer, and musician Carl Hancock Rux, and the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, our own Lynn Nottage, who set the stage, Lynn especially, who set the stage for Brooklyn to become the epicenter of Pulitzer Prize winners in America. Now, I have to tell you, last year, Brooklyn writers won 6 of the 21 awards across America. Not bad. And this year we got another one. By the way, Lynn, as I've shared with you previously, it was my honor to work with your mother of blessed memory, Ruby. Just a tremendous, outstanding leader here in Brooklyn. I'm thrilled to celebrate this cultural medallion and to honor Brooklyn's rich history. Brooklyn has always been the proud creative capital of America, with the largest African-American population of any county that is not its own city. Sadly, even though in my mind Brooklyn will always be a city, we still have the largest by county that is not a city. And it's no surprise that black Brooklynites have made an enormous impact on our country culturally, socially, and politically. From modern writers like Lynn and Carl to fellow Fort Greene residents Colson Whitehead, Colin Channa, and Nelson George, it's clear that Fort Greene is one of the most vibrant neighborhoods in the borough and is a mecca for writers, artists, and musicians. Even in 1938, Fort Greene was the place to be while drafting Native Son, one of the most influential books in American history. Richard Wright drew inspiration from this very neighborhood. Walking over to nearby Fort Greene Park, he would sit on the bench at the top of the hill and write for hours. This cultural medallion, not only honors Richard Wright and the book that forever changed America's understanding of race, it also gives generations of young Brooklynites a sense of history. They need it. Even though Richard Wright may have grown up in Mississippi and lived around the world, and he really did, he wrote his most famous book right here in Brooklyn, USA. So I, in the position you allow me to serve in, I'm the only one that can officially announce he is definitely an official Brooklynite. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Let me get out of your way.
May I acknowledge some of our guests who arrived. Letitia James, the councilwoman of the 35th Council District, and Dolores Newton Fish and Carl Newton, children of Herb and Jane Newton, who lived at 175 Carlton Avenue. I assume you lived here when Richard Wright lived here as well. Our next speaker is Paul Palazzo, a celebrated lighting designer for opera, theater, and museums, current chair of the Historic Fort Greene Association. Please, Paul.
Thank you.
I think I'll go this way.
Yeah. Thank you, Borough President Markowitz, and thank you, Ms. Diamonstein-Spielvogel and the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center for bestowing upon our neighborhood of Fort Greene this well-deserved commemoration to American literary giant Richard Wright. This is the second honor that the HLPC has given Fort Greene, the first at 260 Cumberland Street, given to the poet Marion Moore. While the authors took different artistic paths, they share a common thread in place in Fort Greene. If you visit 260 Cumberland, you'll notice, as in this building, that both structures are unremarkable on the exterior. In fact, the Landmarks Preservation Commission has twice deemed this building 175 Carlton so unremarkable as to not warrant landmark status. But it is what happened quietly inside that was and is remarkable, and the reason why we are gathered here today. Fort Greene is home to the grand cultural monuments and impressive buildings of the Brooklyn Academy of Music, Fort Greene Park's Prison Ship Martyrs Monument, and the Brooklyn Navy Yard. We expect greatness from these structures, either a grand performance by Marian Anderson at BAM, or the heroic efforts of James Fortin as told by the Martyrs Monument, or the patriotic sacrifice made by thousands at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. But here at 175 Cumberland, we are not to expect much. But what came roaring from these unimpressive and to some insignificant walls was grand, heroic, and patriotic. The Fort Greene Association applauds the HLPC for marking this place, for us to see that what seems ordinary on the outside has something extraordinary for us all. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul Palazzo. Our next speaker is Carl Hancock Rux. He was not selected just because he lives down the street. He is a product of the Harlem Writers Workshop, a Columbia University program for young African Americans. And he originated the title role in his notable play, Talk, which won 7 Obie Awards. He also originated the title role in the folk opera The Temptation of St. Anthony, based on Gustave Flaubert's novel.
My remarks are brief and also full of emotion and gladness. I just want to say that when I grew up in New York City foster care for the most part, and when I went to the High School of Music and Art, LaGuardia School of the Arts, and I sat behind my colleague, my friend Lynn Nottage, in English class, and I used to admire her hair at the time. It wasn't, she didn't have long, beautiful dreadlocks at the time. She had a short, natural. I remember watching this girl sitting in front of me and thinking I loved her hair. I loved how it was just sort of always oiled and beautiful. And what I remember also, or rather what I think about now, is that through those many years ago, even though in high school I don't know that we talked a lot, as adults we became friends. We started, we had mutual friends who were playwrights. But I don't know that either one of us knew when we were 14, 15, 16 years old. I don't know that we knew what the world held for us or what we expected to do or to say to the world, that we could actually have a voice, that we had the power of articulation, and that is the power of writing. It is the power of art. It is the power of politics. It is the power of a free mind. And so what impresses me most, I think, about Richard Wright writing a book here on Carlton Avenue, just a few blocks away from where I live, and having my good friend Lynn Nottage here, and also having Howard Pitch, whose home I had visited in Massachusetts, and we first sort of talked about this dream that I had for many years about having more cultural medallions that honored the lives of African Americans, especially here in Fort Greene, and people who I know who have gone unrecognized. And what moves me about this vicinity being so close to the Walt Whitman houses, and the hope that I have that children like myself who had no idea about what the world held for them might walk down the street and stop and look at this sign and see that someone did something here, and that they too have the power to do something, to say something, to be something, to think something. Well, I've said it, the words can't express it. So I am more than happy and more than glad that a dream is being fulfilled today. And that's it. So thank you so much for being here, and really I'm really honored that you picked this building, that you picked this medallion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Mr. Rux brings up an important point. You may have in your hand, I hope, a form to nominate other buildings. It's really other individuals who lived in buildings in this area. There are several criteria that must be followed. 1, it must be a still standing building. 2, not an individually designated landmark. And I'm thinking of adding a third. When you mentioned Walt Whitman, together with the Historic Districts Council, we have been pursuing a medallion for that building, but cannot get signed permission from the person who owns the building. Perhaps your good offices can urge them to do that. And now, Howard Pitch, a resident of Fort Greene for 30 years, a former chair of the Fort Greene Association. He is the author of the pictorial history of this neighborhood entitled Images of America, Fort Greene. Pictured in that book is, of course, Richard Wright. He will read a message from Richard Wright's daughter, Julia, who with her family left, became an expatriate when she was a teenager, and has lived her life in France. We'll be interested to hear her comments.
It was my pleasure and honor to speak with Julia just the other day in Paris. She said, my son Matthew and I are so deeply happy and honored about this, and she added that, I know somewhere my father is smiling. And now this is what she wrote, if I can see it. It is from the distance of Richard Wright's exile and final resting place that I send these words of heartfelt thanks to your labor of love for Richard's creativity. My special thanks to Mrs. Barbara Lee Diamond Spielvogel and Paul Palazzo. As many of you know, on July 4th, 2012, the Library of Congress selected the 88 books that shaped America, all by American authors. Native Son was one of the 88 choices and one of the 35 choices of books published between 1900 and 1950. Simply to say that your initiative for the Medallion is timely and historic. And so, Bigger Thomas was born in this house. I think of Bigger in many ways, sometimes as my paper brother. But now, as a senior myself, I think of him as still immensely fragile son who haunts America. I therefore put the question to my own biological son, Matthew, now nearer in years to Bigger than I am. His answer was that Bigger haunts America more than ever because America, after her financial crises, and now has to deal with the social crises they caused, and now boldly needs to look at her history and rediscover her Biggers even more than she needs to rediscover her superheroes. Since I knew you would be standing at the place of Bigger's birth, I reread the first pages of Richard Wright's Introduction to Native Son, an essay called How Bigger Was Born. His first words point to the right direction. Bigger is potentially in all of us. Bigger is our anger, our frustration, our questions left unanswered, our inability to articulate our sense of injustice. So deep is a self-censorship inculcated in an education which self-censors itself. Bigger is white as well as black. Bigger is everywhere. Bigger is within. Richard Wright tried to teach within himself, take his own Bigger by the hand, and face America with Bigger at his side. I was born 2 years after Bigger, and I owe so much in my upbringing to Richard and to Ellen Wright, whose son and daughter are here today, to my elder paper sibling, as I call him, the gift of freedom, love, literacy, and most of all, of a free rein to creativity able to replace my own anger. As you stand below this historic medallion, you are surrounded by other spirits from the February house in Midog Street, which stands no longer. You are joined by the presence of Carson McCullers, W.H. Auden, George Davis, and even Gypsy Rose Lee, Benjamin Britten, and others. You are joined by Ellen Wright and Richard Wright, and by legions of Biggers, whose, quote, hope is always somewhere deep down within them. So thank you for literary ecology, which represents the housing of creativity and marks those houses for the generations to come. In deep gratitude, Julia Wright.
I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Lynn Nottage, prize-winning playwright. In fact, multiple prize-winning playwright. I can't think of one that you haven't won yet. She is the recipient of the Pulitzer Prize for her play, Ruined, the New York Drama Critics Circle, the Drama Desk, the Outer Critics Award for Best Play, among her many other honors. Additionally, she was the recipient of the 2007 MacArthur Genius Award, the 2005 Guggenheim Award, and the August Wilson and the Laura Pels Playwriting Awards, a graduate of Brown University and the Yale School of Drama, where she is currently a visiting lecturer. That is, when she is not filming what she has earlier today described as a mockumentary nearby. We'll look forward to seeing those results like all your other efforts. Thank you for joining us, Lynn Nottage.
Thank you. I'm really very, very honored to be here. I have to begin by thanking Letitia James and Borough President and Velman at Montgomery for being such champions of the arts. You know, we couldn't sort of survive here in Brooklyn unless we had the support of our politicians. And I have to give a particular thanks to Carl Hancock Rux, who, as he mentioned, we've had a long journey from the Castle on the Hill in Harlem, music and art, through to Brooklyn, brownstones, and he has been just such an incredible champion of Black arts movement and also preserving our history. So thank you for that, and thank you for this. This place is rich with history, and I think it's important to commemorate some of our literary giants. I believe that homes hold the spirit and energy of all who've passed through them, whether we recognize it or not. These brownstones behind us contain the memories of the struggle that yielded native sun and fostered hundreds of words that mesmerized a generation of readers. This is the place where Richard Wright organized a series of words that I found very early in my life and awakened my passion to tell stories. And if I can just share a quick memory, I grew up not so many blocks away from here in a neighborhood that is like this one, that has for generations welcomed writers looking for a quiet, complicated place to settle and write. And I described this neighborhood and the neighborhood where I grew up as a place between places, the sinewy connective tissue that links communities, a place where really grisly and textured place that provides inspiration and refuge for writers and artists and adventurous spirits who are looking beyond the ordinary. And I think that Fort Greene has been a place like that for generations. And I also think that Borum Hill, where I grew up, has been a place like that. And as a child in this place between places, I remember climbing a massive, imposing bookshelf in my parents' house. And I wanted to read something that was challenging, and I wanted to read something that was difficult, and I wanted to read something that was different, and something that was not offered in the school that I was going into that had a very limited notion of what the canon should be. And it was in this place between places that I climbed the formidable wall of papers that was filled with the angry and loving musings of a generation of African American writers in search of expression. And a book that called out to me had the most poetic and the least poetic of titles, and it was Black Boy. And it was written by this author who I'd never heard of, and his name was Richard Wright. And my curiosity at that time was completely unblemished by expectation. I didn't know what I was going to find between these crumbling pages, but what I discovered literally transformed me, and I can say that absolutely. It was a story that was frighteningly provocative and stark and unapologetic and stirring and visceral in a way that I had never experienced before. And we all have these moments that awaken us, these doors that lead us to new worlds and possibilities. And on this brick shelf in Brooklyn, in this place between places not that far from here, I discovered a passion to read and the power of storytelling to connect us to lives of others. And I discovered that stories could be more than fairy tales, that they could be potent, and they could be political, and they could be passionate, and they could be personal roadmaps leading us to unexpected destinations. And so I celebrate this place because this place is a sacred place. And it's a place that holds the spirit of Richard Wright, who was one of my personal literary heroes. And I thank the Landmarks Preservation Center for placing this medallion, because I feel that it will not only give Richard Wright a permanent home, but it will provide a beacon for a generation of writers and artists and thinkers and people in the community to look to for generations. So thank you.
Thank you, Lynn Navish. To remind, if any of you have information about an individual who has made a remarkable contribution, please forward it to me. You might look online, HLPC, culturalmedallions.org. Before we conclude our ceremony, I'd like to ask Paul Palazzo and Howard Fitch to come forward to unveil the cultural medallion that we are talking about. Will you unveil it and will you read the text?
I'll read the text. Okay, Howard. Let's do it. And the plaque reads, Richard N. Wright, September 4th, 1908 to November 28th, 1960, 175 Carlton Avenue, Brooklyn. Grandson of slaves and son of a sharecropper who abandoned him, Mississippi-born Wright moved to Chicago in 1927 and 10 years later came to New York. Here he befriended Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man, and became Harlem editor of the Daily Worker. From this house in 1938, he often went to Fort Greene Park to jot notes for his novel Native Son in 1940. In describing the theme, Wright said, "Men can starve from a lack of self-realization as much from a lack of bread." The novel, the first work of an African-American author selected by the Book of the Month Club, was adapted as a play directed by Orson Welles in 1941. Among his other books are Uncle Tom's Children, 1938, and Black Boy, 1945. Wright and his family moved to Paris as expatriates in 1946, where he died in 1960, and was interred at Père Lachaise Cemetery. This is presented by the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center. Thank you again.
Thank you. And thanks to each and all of you, participants, audience, for being here today. And we would like to hear from you with other nominations. Thank you for being here.
Your phone just changed to email. Thank you. What do you think of that?
Good as we're gonna look.
What do you think of Native Son?
It's rough.